Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much. That was certainly enlightening. And I want to commend you and your staff for doing a very thorough analysis of this problem. Let me ask a question. They want to open up to my colleagues for any questions that they may have. The JC and the OC have some serious problems. The AOC have some serious problems. Ms. Howell, I understand that your office has conducted regular audits regarding the contracting practices of the AOC and the judicial branch. How surprised were you to discover the magnitude of these particular issues, for one? And then two, you mentioned about the culture that exists, and what are some of your recommendations to try to implement regarding some of the cultures that exist within this branch? And what do you think needs to take place with the Judicial Council and the AOC to change this kind of culture?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to defer to John. He has been working on some of the procurement audits that we are doing out at the local courts, but I certainly can handle the question related to the culture. And I certainly don't want to be disrespectful to the AOC. Hardworking people. I think the Chief Justice, when she came in, asked for this comprehensive survey. I think that was a fabulous step. I think that analysis that was done by that group was very comprehensive, and they have very reasoned and thoughtful recommendations. My concern about culture is separate branch of government. They have asserted that they've implemented some of the recommendations in this report. We don't see it that way. Some of the information that they shared with us during the course of the audit, certainly we're cooperative with my office and my staff, but we really believe, based on the history of what we've seen in auditing the CCMS project, now conducting this audit, and seeing that so many of the recommendations that we have made in this report were made 3 years ago, and there really hasn't been significant change. I do believe Mr. Hoshino is a good add to the AOC for a variety of reasons. I know he's very well respected in this building. He has experience working at other state agencies. When he met with my staff when he first took over, he said, "I'm open. I have no preconceived notions. I have no particular perspective one way or the other. My job is to try to, serve as well as I can as the new administrative director for the AOC." So I think that's a good change. But anyone in a leadership position like that needs to have support. And he needs to know that the Judicial Council is behind him, and I certainly believe the Chief Justice is behind him. I have not had the opportunity to speak with her since we issued the report, but I have met with her in the past, and she seems very committed to, making sure that access to justice, that's her mantra, certainly is very important to her. But I think there's some cultural change, with all due respect, that needs to happen at the AOC and in their executive level, because they basically lead by example. And that was something that was discussed in the Strategic Evaluation Committee report. They talk the talk. This is a quote from that report I read last night. They talk the talk, they don't walk the walk. So there has to be change at the agency. With that, John Byer, the audit principal, he has worked on some of the other, as I'm sure you're aware, we are required annually to audit a sample of judicial entities looking at procurement practices. So I'll let John handle that question.
John Byer, I'm the principal auditor with the State Auditor's Office. Yes, we do procurement audits of the trial courts and of the AOC. Every other year we do the trial courts, a sample of trial courts. The last time was 5. And we also do the AOC on the alternate years. Upcoming is our audit of AOC this year. Those audits are very focused on contracting practices and are very narrow in that respect. We're mainly looking for compliance with AOC's procedures and policies. So they don't really get to the broader scope of whether or not the contracts themselves were for a specific purpose and what the purposes were of those contracts.
Great. Committee members, any questions for Ms. Howe? Mr. Jones Sawyer.
I have several, but I'll keep it down to a minimum because we have other testimony. I I agree with you that we need to work closely with the Chief Justice, Tani Cantil Sakakwe. And I apologize for another hyphenated last name person if I butchered your name, but and Martin Yoshino. We need to work together with both of them to effect this change, because my question is more of who really is in charge over there at the courts. And I'm not blaming them. I'm blaming more the structure. When you go up through the structure, the presiding judges have a lot of authority. As I mentioned earlier, with the closure of the David Kenyon Juvenile Justice System and Center in my district, after we gave the local courts $26 million, the next day it immediately closed that. And I know you made a comment that it's about $1 million in all of the different monies that are paid to the high-level employees, but that could have kept that court open. So it's not just a little money. It's not just a little money to a lot of members here who may have smaller courts where that money could have kept their court open. And so I agree with you that we do have a lot of committees in place there, but I used to be an administrator, and I've gone through several audits. I even made an auditor cry one time, and I know how, not you, but I know how to get through this, but I also know how to wait it out until after the auditors are gone, the elected officials are gone, and then we go back to business as usual. And so I'm really trying to come up with a way we can help the existing management there right now put in place long-term, sustainable accountability measures, transparency measures. Maybe it is auditing every once in a while. But my real question is, excuse me, do you get a sense of if there's anyone truly in charge? I mean, you talk about the strategic council, strategic evaluation committee report in that council coming with some excellent recommendations, but somebody's got to implement them. And if you have no one to implement them, no one to do the carrot and stick to ensure that it gets done in a timely manner, it'll never get done. And I think that might be part of the problem, that there's probably an entrenched group of people within the system that are comfortable with status quo. And so did you ever get a sense that there's anyone who will actually take the bull by the horn and make these things happen? Or is it the function of the different committees and things of that nature very difficult to really drill down and make some significant changes? And if there's anything you can suggest to get us there.
Yeah, I'll allow my staff to comment on some of that. But I think certainly the administrative director of the courts, and I think that's why, no disrespect to any prior administration, I think Martin was a good hire as far as the AOC is concerned, because he's been at the Department of Corrections. That's a huge agency as far as trying to deal with culture and change, et cetera. So I think that's a step in the right direction, absolutely, but he's only one person. I think that the Judicial Council itself, and that's why we raised concerns that the Judicial Council essentially has delegated a lot of responsibility, but not necessarily holding the administrative director of the courts and other executives within the AOC accountable for change. And that's that tone from the top. There has to be that leadership from that perspective. I can't necessarily comment on committees beyond the ones that we talk about a little bit in the audit report, but again, the concern there, and staff can elaborate for me, is those committees had certain responsibilities, but they didn't really have access to information, and they were really subject to whatever the AOC decides to give to them as far as information. They didn't have full information related to expenditures and related to budgeting and related to decision making, so that they could question decisions that were being made. In some cases, the AOC staff were able to actually, and I'll have my audit staff explain it better than I, but essentially change decisions. They may have presented a decision and then later they decide to change it as far as how they're going to use some local assistance money, not necessarily going back to that committee. So I'm going to defer to Kathleen Fullerton and John Byer, and they can talk a little bit about that. But Kathleen, why don't you start?
Sure. I'm Kathleen Fullerton. I was the audit supervisor. As the state auditor said, the responsibility rests with the Judicial Council, and they've delegated a significant amount of authority to the AOC. The situation that she was mentioning relates to the Trial Court Budget Advisory Committee. And that committee relies on the AOC to provide it with information to make very critical decisions. And we reviewed the documentation that was given to this committee, some of it quite voluminous. And there are certain critical decisions that the AOC just does not inform this committee about. And one example is their decision to use local assistance funds instead of state operations funds. So there are some circumstances where the AOC itself will be completely in charge of the decision to use local assistance money rather than using a state operations appropriation for that purpose. So if the Judicial Council is going to delegate this authority to the AOC, I think it's critical that they put some controls in place to ensure that the AOC is meeting its responsibility with the authority they've been given.
Senator.
Just to elaborate a little bit, the accounting information and the expenditure information we have in this report was not readily available during the beginning of the audit, and we worked with AOC over a number of months to try to get this information out of its accounting system. We have separate IT experts who will download information from an accounting system and then analyze it for us. But it took them and us months of working with AOC and working with its staff to finally get the numbers that we have in the report. Yeah, Elaine talked about the culture change a little bit. I do want to say that the Chief of Staff at the AOC, Jodi Patel, she did work with us extensively during the course of the audit, met with us, was always available to us, and seemed very open to our recommendations during the course of the audit. And I want to give her credit for that.
Thank you very much. Senator Roth.
You know, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I'm mindful of the fact that I think this judiciary is a separate branch of our government in the state of California, and so while some of you have heard me before, I'm absolutely insistent that government be efficient and effective. It seems to me that our insistence on efficiency is largely through the budgetary process and how we allocate money to this branch. I'm a little reluctant to get into the day-to-day operation dictating whether they have 22 cars or 24 and how they're used. Having said that, it seems to me we're talking about 14% of the budget here, aren't we? Because 86% is directly driven down to the trial courts for trial court use.
There is, based on the legislative analyst presentation and some information we have in the audit report, that's correct. There is a fair amount of money that is direct, and it's in statute as how the allocation works, but money that the legislature appropriates goes directly to the trial courts through that allocation. But it goes to the Judicial Council. They craft the formula and then allocate it directly. So you're correct, Senator.
So if we attached a dollar figure to each of the deficiencies that you identified in your audit report, what would the total be out of this approximately $3 billion budget? Is that a fair question?
That would be something that we would have to go back and recraft. I mean, we have various examples in the report related to the use of contractors, et cetera. But that $386 million portion in the pie chart that John Byer indicated. Our IT folks had to get that information, and that 186 on temporary employees, some of the 72 million related to information technology, some of the others. But that piece, and in fairness, it's not the full 386. It's some portion of that we had concerns with. I don't have an exact amount for you today.
Right, because some of the services the AOC provides in looking at the charts, I mean, it looks like 54 courts, and I assume that's 54 county courts utilize the services. One was 55, 56, 53. So even on the subject of services, many of the courts use some of the services fairly extensively, if that makes sense. And then I assume that there are other items in the report where there's more money or less money that is left on the table that should be used more efficiently. Well, that would be an interesting figure, right? Because the total budget's $3 billion. So if the total is $30 million on a $3 billion budget, while we should be obviously sensitive to that and urge the judicial branch to be more efficient, it's somewhat less impactful than if it were $500 million in another computer project, right?
Certainly, Senator. One perspective I would like to share, however, is, and you're absolutely right, and that's why we felt it was important for us when we conducted the survey to present both sides of the equation. Those services that many, many courts, as you indicate in that table shows, 55, 56 courts are using those services, and those are valuable. And that's important information for the AOC to have. These are services that are core to the trial courts being able to provide access to justice. But the flip side is that other figure, that other table that shows 1 or 2 or 3 courts using a service that AOC is providing. AOC could then make an informed decision. Is that a service we need to continue to provide? Is it something that's essential? And how much are we spending on that? I don't know how much they're spending on that. The other point that I'd like to make is we discuss in the audit report, and we have in the introduction, we show budget cuts over the last, it's over a 3-year window from 2010-11 to 12-13. And the AOC, the Administrative Office of Courts, took about a 7% hit. The trial courts took almost $1 billion hit, $952 million. So the point we were trying to make, because I absolutely agree with you, and we try to be fair, and that's why we put information in here. Monetarily, this is not a significant amount of money, but it speaks volumes to AOC as an administering body. Are you making prudent decisions so that you are being as efficient as you possibly can in spending dollars to make sure that you can maximize the amount of money that goes to the courts so that they can use that money to provide access to justice? So that would be my point, my comment on yours. I absolutely agree it's a small amount of money, but again, it's all about perception and the way the AOC is exercising its responsibilities.
Right.
We believe they should be more prudent.
And I don't mean to minimize it. I mean, every $1 million, we fight for $1 million up here for projects and normally have to steal it from somebody else's pet rock. For example, to answer some of the concern of my colleagues, my recollection is we closed somewhere around 50 courthouses and 200 courtrooms, give or take, and if it's about $1 million or $1.2 million a judge and ancillary personnel, then the total would be interesting, I think, for my colleagues to compare the total amount not used efficiently with the amount that it would have taken to have kept some of those courthouses and courtrooms open. Just one final question having to do with these salaries. Is there anything that dictated that the AOC follow the executive branch's career executive assignment salary schedule and setting pay?
No, there's nothing that requires them to follow executive branch salaries. We just felt that one of the questions was comparing the state of California to some other states, and we looked at Texas. We tried to look at New York. We couldn't get information from New York. We saw that Texas clearly aligns itself with the executive branch. And what we also looked at is what some of the responsibilities of these individuals are. Some of these offices are as small as 12-person offices, and some are up to 100, 111, 112 employees. And the responsibilities, such as HR, is similar to an HR office at a state agency. So we were really looking to see if you believe this is the salary that these people should be compensated for what they're responsible for, show us the justification for that. We weren't necessarily saying they had to be executive branch salaries, but why are they different? The responsibilities seem very similar, and they couldn't provide us that justification.
And is the point that anything above the $130,032 at the bottom in red is subject to scrutiny?
Well,
which would include several agencies, including the Controller's Office.
Absolutely agree. I mean, you have the Department of Corrections, Department of Public Health at the top, but again, agency secretary and the director, again, looking at what their responsibilities are, I would assume there's justification for those salaries as far as what those entities are responsible for. But that was the point. The highest, this CEA level C salary, it's not just the employees on this table, but what we tried to illustrate with the red circle is there are 88 employees within AOC who are making more than $130,000 a year. And again, it's not suggesting that they shouldn't be making that, but we wanted to see, auditors, show me. We would want to see evidence to convince us that that salary is justified, and that's what we were not seeing.
around here, we're used to people appearing in front of us who make significantly more money than we do, so it doesn't surprise me that they make more than electeds. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Member Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for members, remembering why we're here, we're looking at, and we've been struggling with access to justice issues that declining court expenditures have resulted in, and I think it's absolutely our obligation to do oversight and to ask the questions even of the other branches of government. And if you think even to $1 million to keep a courtroom open from an access to justice standpoint, if we're then opening 10, 20 other courtrooms strategically placed throughout the state, could have really a significant impact. And for the auditor, you touch a lot on in your words, the disconnect between AOC and the trial courts, and point out areas where the expectations are a little bit different. And yet one of your recommendations is the fee-for-service model, and you mentioned there are some courts that were for it and some courts that are against it. And I can imagine a very large court who can afford to provide a lot of those services themselves and would benefit under a model like that would be thrilled. And yet other courts, smaller courts, who really cannot afford to then pay for the services that they rely on from the AOC. So from an implementation standpoint, looking at that fee-for-service, did you tease out, or did you look at, since you're making that as a recommendation to the court system, did you look at the potential disparate impact on the sizes of the courts that would then be obligated under a model like that to take some of the money that they need for their operations and then paying for those services?
Again, I'll ask my staff to elaborate, but from my perspective, Mr. Stone, the discussion as far as fee-for-service, we wanted to present that in alignment with the survey that we had done, because we believe there clearly are some core services that AOC provides that the majority of the courts, as that table shows, benefit from. Maybe those are core services that the AOC continues to provide to all courts and as a fundamental basis. And then you have additional services that essentially an a la carte or fee-for-service model, where courts can make a decision, yeah, that's a service that we would like to pay for. And we tried to contemplate, sure, there's going to be a disparate, a very small court may be much more reliant on AOC. And in fact, I think the appellates or the Supreme Court really talked to our staff, and again, I'll have my staff discuss that a little bit. They were very, very dependent on AOC, and they felt AOC was very valuable to them. So I think if this proposal or suggestion that we have in our report is something that is really pursued and discussed, absolutely, that has to be part of the dialogue. Maybe there's a fundamental level of services that are necessary for all of the courts that AOC continues to provide, but then there are additional services that are over and above that then the courts can ultimately make the decision as to whether or not they want to pay for that service or whether they want to contract it out. When we talk to some of the 10 courts, some of them, and we have comments in the audit report, said, I'd like to be able to shop around and see if I can get that service cheaper by contracting out for that services rather than having AOC provide that service. But again, I'm going to defer to my staff because I think they could elaborate on this. So.
Yeah, you're correct that the size of the court does influence the reliance on the AOC. So we talk about in the report on page 60, you'll see that we separated out the size of the court by the reliance on the AOC services. And the very small courts actually had the lowest percentage of reliance, and the large courts had the highest percent. And when we talked to these 10 courts about whether or not they thought a fee-for-service was and potentially whether it would work, Los Angeles said yes, they would be interested in such a model. But the recommendation is to the AOC to really explore this type of model, because what needs to happen first is determining how much those services are going to cost. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a significant undertaking on the part of the AOC to determine what the core services will be and then how much all the rest of those services are going to cost. So maybe at that point, when they determine how much everything is going to cost, would be a good time to come back and determine really the feasibility for the courts.
And because I understand the data you had in the courts that you talked to, but as this proposal is fleshed out, I will just tell you that I've been hearing from some courts that are a little stressed about that possibility. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We're going to ask the representatives from the AOC and the judicial branch to please come forward. We understand that we have the Honorable Marcia Slough with us, the presiding judge for the San Bernardino Superior Court and the chair of the Trial Court Presiding Judge Advisory Committee, Martin Hoshino, the Administrative Director, Courtney Jasper, Director of the Governmental Affairs. Would you please come to the table and join us? Ms. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning, members. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm Martin Hoshino. I am the relatively new Administrative Director of the courts, as you heard. I have with me Judge Marcia Slough from San Bernardino. I'll let her introduce herself in a minute. I really relish the opportunity to be here after leaving the executive branch in the many years that I served there. I had great concern that I would not be able to return to the legislature to work through some very difficult, complicated and issues to grapple, and I'm confident and hopeful and optimistic that we will be able to engage these issues together and solve many of these problems for the betterment of California. To my right, Judge Slough.